The Huron tribe was completely annihilated due to the colonizers. As for the Apache tribe, not only did they survive the American genocide, but they even struck fear into the hearts of the colonizers. Today you'll learn about the Indigenous American tribes that have survived to this day, how people in the modern United States are discriminated against due to their tribal affiliations, and why some indigenous people couldn't withstand the colonizers and Americans. Enjoy watching. The native inhabitants of North and South America are collectively known as Indigenous Americans or Native Americans. The similarity in their name to the people of India is not a coincidence, but rather has a straightforward reason. Christopher Columbus, the man who discovered America, believed that he had arrived in India, not a new continent. Upon meeting the locals, he couldn't fathom that they were an entirely different people. Their way of life and customs resembled what he knew in India. That's why he named them Indians. To avoid confusion later, the local tribes came to be known as Indians. It is believed that before the discovery of America, the continent and its islands were inhabited by Vikings. Some evidence supporting this theory has been found in Canada. Of course, we can never be 100% certain about this, as reliable information is hard to come by, but this theory has become one of the most popular. You'll learn more about the lives of North and South American peoples before colonization in the following sections. According to various estimates, there were several million to tens of millions of indigenous people living on the continent before the arrival of Europeans. The existing tribes were not highly developed and their numbers were quite large. The main difference between these communities lay in the languages spoken by the local residents and their traditions. These distinctions manifested in their clothing, customs, and their friendliness toward one another. Some tribes were nomadic, constantly moving, while others adopted a sedentary lifestyle. This determined the occupations of the inhabitants. For instance, sedentary tribes had highly developed agriculture and animal husbandry, whereas constantly migrating aboriginals were skilled hunters and gatherers. Society had differences in its structure as well. Matriarchy was prevalent in some areas, while patriarchy existed in others. In the most advanced tribes, a transition to class-based societies was underway. Decision-making in these communities was based on consensus. Nearly all community members were involved in making crucial decisions, and every voice was taken into account. Debates were used to determine the most suitable political solutions. Indigenous American religion was animistic. This means they believed in the existence of various spirits and souls. In other words, Indigenous Americans attributed life to everything around them. Medicine in the tribes was not highly advanced. Indigenous Americans practiced herbal medicine. Perhaps given their immunity and the diseases present on the continent before colonization, this was sufficient. However, diseases brought from Europe led to the death of many indigenous people. Until the discovery of America, the local tribes lived a peaceful and tranquil life. Conflicts between communities rarely led to major wars or genocides. However, the arrival of civilized society nearly wiped out the local tribes. You'll learn more about how this occurred in the following sections. In 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the American islands. The explorer was convinced that he had reached India. Columbus conducted 4 expeditions in total, during which he always brought back several indigenous people, new plants, gold, and bird feathers. The explorer worked in the interest of Spain, his home country. However, these voyages did not substantially enrich the Spanish treasury. Columbus's situation worsened in 1498, when another explorer, Vasco da Gama, discovered the true sea route to India and labeled Christopher Columbus a fraud. As a result, in 1500, Columbus was arrested on the very islands he had discovered and sent to Spain. Back in his homeland, wealthy individuals interceded for him and requested the Queen's pardon to release the explorer. This helped Columbus avoid imprisonment. From 1502, active colonization of the Antilles began. Naturally, the local population wasn't particularly pleased with their new neighbors, who began subjugating the indigenous inhabitants. Local conflicts arose, often resulting in bloody wars. It was from the Antilles that the further expansion into continental America and all the horrors that unfolded there began. The tumultuous life of the indigenous Americans began almost immediately after Columbus discovered America. From his early voyages, he was already bringing people back as slaves, and when other colonists began arriving on the Antilles, things got even worse for the local population. Developed European societies never considered the indigenous people as equals. African colonies were built on slave labor and brutal treatment of the local population. The same happened with the American Indians. Starting from 1502, just a decade after the discovery, there was an active settlement of the islands near the mainland. Needless to say, numerous conflicts resulted in the deaths of many indigenous people. On the island of Haiti, about 15,000 indigenous people were annihilated in the first years of colonization. By the end of the 16th century, they were almost entirely wiped out. To replace the depleted workforce, indigenous people from other islands were transported to Haiti. One can only guess at the horrors that truly transpired. According to official information, in 1539, Francisco de Chaves razed the kingdom of Carua Conchucos to the ground and killed 600 children in the process. This became the largest child massacre in history. Indigenous people tried to resist the colonizers in any way they could. However, their resistance led to increasingly dire conflicts. In 1598, in response to the killing of 11 Spanish soldiers, a punitive expedition was carried out. About 800 indigenous people were killed, and all men over 25 years of age had one leg amputated. The Spanish even devised horrifying games where they wagered on whether a person could cut an indigenous body in half with a single sword strike. After these gruesome games, the bodies were simply fed to the dogs. In 1637, English colonists attacked a village of one tribe. According to different accounts, about 600 to 700 people were burned alive that day, but the reduction in the local population didn't only result from these murders. In addition to punitive operations and genocide, another problem for the local population was the diseases brought by the colonizers, such as smallpox, flu, and plague. If nearly everyone in Europe had experienced one or another illness and could easily endure them, the American population had possibly never even heard of some of these diseases. Their immune systems were ill-prepared for new diseases, causing mass deaths among indigenous people from what are considered simple illnesses in developed countries. All of these horrors intensified particularly with the formation of the United States of America. The genocide of Native Americans began in the early days of American independence. At that time, clashes between settlers and indigenous people were not uncommon. In 1825, a horrific law was passed. According to it, only colonists could claim ownership of land, and the local population had no right to do so. The only thing they could do was live on this territory. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the indigenous people, as everything they had earned through hard work could be easily taken away. This marked the beginning of frequent conflicts between the local population and the colonizers. Skirmishes occurred almost daily, but indigenous people had little chance of defending themselves, let alone winning. The technological advancement of the colonizers was several steps ahead of the indigenous peoples. While indigenous people used bows and cold weapons, the US Army extensively employed firearms and cannons. In addition to military actions between indigenous people and the US Army, various horrifying incidents frequently occurred. In 1860, near the California coast, several landowners and businessmen conducted a massacre of indigenous people. They killed women and the elderly. According to different reports, that day saw the death of 60 to 200 people. The murderers wielded axes and knives. Colonizers often appropriated the most valuable territories for themselves. For example, many valuable minerals were found along the Amazon River, which were of great interest to them. Naturally, the indigenous people who lived in these areas opposed their new neighbors, who didn't treat them well either. In 1850, a law on the management and protection of indigenous people was passed. Based on this act, inequality between indigenous people and US citizens was enshrined in law. However, it did have certain benefits, such as providing legal protection for local residents and allowing them to live on private lands. The government tried to suppress hostile indigenous people and allocated significant funds to create specialized police units. In theory, all of this was supposed to resolve conflicts between indigenous people and US citizens, but in practice, the number of rebel groups only increased. After years of oppression and genocide, indigenous tribes managed to start living alongside the new state. However, they had to assimilate, which means they lost some of their customs, traditions, and adapted to a new way of life in an advanced society. It's worth noting that some tribes were entirely wiped out because they refused to change their ways to fit the new world and resisted it. In modern society, Native Americans no longer live in villages and don't use bows and arrows. They've been able to start a new life in contemporary society. Many of them use smartphones, some own cars, homes, and have bank accounts. In general, they live like ordinary people. However, there is one exception. Discrimination against the indigenous population hasn't disappeared. According to statistics, 1 in 4 Native Americans is living in poverty, as only 36% of men are employed full-time. The unemployment rate is at 80%, and 76% of those fortunate enough to have a job earn the minimum wage. Native American women are sexually assaulted 3.5 times more often than other American women, with the majority of the crimes crimes committed by individuals from other races. One indigenous woman in an interview recounted an incident where a man approached her and said that if he had met her 40 years ago, he would have raped her right then and there without facing any consequences. Native Americans also face oppression in their traditions and holidays. Many of the indigenous people get into conflicts over events they participate in or clothing that reflects their affiliation with a particular race. Unfortunately, these conflicts have yet to be resolved. Fortunately, there are non-governmental organizations that protect the rights of Native Americans. However, from the government's perspective, there doesn't seem to be much progress, and in fact, police arrest Native American citizens more frequently than others. Some tribes are not even officially recognized as indigenous people. All of this is shocking because it's hard to believe that it could happen in modern society. To preserve the culture and representatives of the indigenous population, special reservations were created. These are territories set aside specifically for the habitation of Native Americans. Many such places were formed as a result of agreements between local residents and the US government. However, not all of them came into existence due to treaties, and not all were established on the historical homelands of the tribes. Efforts are being made not only to create a separate safe zone for the indigenous population, but also to support their culture and to some extent develop it. As we've already mentioned, there are special organizations that support Native Americans and help them overcome oppression. They not only assist indigenous people in defending their rights, but also create conditions for the development of Native American culture. Special holidays are organized to showcase their customs, clothing, and way of life. These are aimed at introducing Americans to the culture of other nations and preserving the individuality of Native Americans. Unfortunately, this hasn't been very effective in addressing the oppression of the indigenous population. Unfortunately, many Native American nations in North and South America suffered greatly due to colonization and the subsequent arrival of new inhabitants on the continents. For example, the Cheyenne tribe. These people twice entered into agreements with the US government regarding friendly and trade relations. However, the Americans didn't particularly strive to abide by these rules. Due to constant oppression and attacks, the tribe eventually chose the path of war against their oppressors. Naturally, the balance of power in this war was far from equal. While the Cheyenne received support from other tribes such as the Arapaho, Kiowa, and other lesser-known communities, they couldn't withstand the progressive US Army. Nonetheless, they did earn a reputation as fierce and brave warriors. Yet this didn't save the Cheyenne people from near extinction. Today, there are fewer than 20,000 representatives of this indigenous population. Remember when we talked about another issue that Native Americans encountered when colonizers arrived? That's right, it's the diseases brought from Europe. The peaceful Huron tribe often competed with other tribes for dominance in the fur trade, which frequently led to conflicts with other tribes. These people preferred a vegetarian diet, which primarily consisted of beans and maize, and they occasionally ate meat, especially on holidays. However, they had a distinctive practice in that they ritually prepared and consumed dogs. Unfortunately, none of the members of this tribe survived to our time. The reason is simple. The missionary activities of the French brought a terrible disease into the homes of the indigenous population – plague. Their bodies, which had never encountered such diseases, had no immunity to them. It's somewhat surprising, but the more warlike Apache tribe managed to survive the Native American genocide. These people often raided colonizers from various countries. They frequently clashed with Americans and Mexicans who had settled on their lands, and they didn't spare other tribes either. Many recognized their talent for guerrilla warfare. They would often launch unexpected raids and swiftly disappear from the battlefield. Many well-known military leaders hailed from this tribe, striking fear into their opponents. Among them were individuals like Colorado, Cochise, Victoria, and Geronimo, who fought against Americans even after Native Americans were confined to reservations on the Great Plains. Today, there are approximately 100,000 representatives of this tribe. The Iroquois didn't get their name from their hairstyle. In their language, it means rattlesnakes. These people fully lived up to such a name. When the first colonists arrived in the New World, the Iroquois became the most advanced tribe. They engaged in farming, mastered various crafts, and didn't engage in significant conflicts with their neighbors. Another interesting fact is that women held primary authority in their society, which was to some extent matriarchal. However, these people weren't always peaceful. In their quest for dominance in the fur trade, they often brutally mistreated their opponents. Most frequently, the Iroquois came into conflict with the Huron people. The Huron managed to survive the Native American genocide, conquer various diseases, and live to the present day. The current population of the Iroquois numbers over 100,000, making them one of the most numerous indigenous tribes still in existence today.